Hey, hi, and welcome. Alright, let's jump into this. Okay, fiberglass kayaks versus polyethylene kayaks or molded kayaks or whichever. I mean, there's a lot of new technology coming out there, and it's not quite plastic, it's not quite ABS, it's not quite fiberglass, it's not quite whatever it is. Now, it's been a while since I've been into kayaking. I sold what you're looking at here is my Boreal Inukshuk. Great kayak as a touring kayak. A little bit on the big side if you're not going to be loading it up. So I probably would have been better off to go to the one down from it, the Muktuk, which was an excellent handling kayak, better day tripper type of thing, and probably a good, light touring. This thing was like the Queen Mary and the Shanghai Express and all in one. Although it was a very good handling kayak and a great kayak to stay dry in, that's for sure. But anyway, when I was looking for kayaks, I did have fiberglass in mind. Now, my experience goes like this. I grew up as a kid, everybody pretty much used canoes. Kayaks, they were there, but not a lot of people. It's not like you see now where, I would say somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000s, the kayaking craze really just took off. I don't know why that was. I mean, kayaks have been around forever and a day. In fact, the Inuit have been using kayaks for probably 1,000 years, maybe more. Nobody really knows. But the usefulness of a kayak is definitely a topic all unto itself. So I started looking for kayaks, and my budget wasn't too bad. Well, my second kayak. First off, I didn't know how much I was going to use it and stuff like that. So I lived in the city of Ottawa at the time, right beside the Ottawa River. One of the best places you could ever kayak. It's a really good place uh, for kayakers and stuff like that. You got, there's no shortage of exploring you can do. So my second kayak, I knew I wanted something bigger, longer than my new kayak. Sorry for the cough there. And I knew I wanted something that was going to track well. The wind was my number one concern. Strangely enough, I went with this kayak just because it stayed so dry. It tracked well. It wasn't too bad with the wind, but it was a little bit bulky in the volume side when you didn't have it loaded down, and the wind did push you around a little bit. Not too bad. It was long enough that it tracked well, so you could live with it. But I knew that I wanted something a little stiffer, a little faster, but also lighter. But however, the argument usually goes, you know, you know, fiberglass kayaks are, or fiberglass in general, is stiffer ride, so usually you get better performance. But when it comes to beaching the whale, usually you can smack the polyethylene kayaks into it quite a bit. But some people also don't understand that the fiberglass kayaks, they're not really any more or less maintenance. They really are. You have to polish them up the same way the polyethylene kayaks. The sun is what deteriorates both fiberglass and polyethylene, probably at about the same rate. Depending on it, like my plastic kayaks, I always, gave them a clean down and put the UV protected coating on them, after every few uses or whatever. I kept them in good shape. But if you don't, yeah, they will get chalky on you. Once you break through that layer of protective coat, the plastic will rot and crack on you the same way the fiberglass is. Difference is fiberglass is actually in some ways easier to repair than the plastic. So there's that. However, the fiberglass being stiffer, if you hit a big rock, it's probably easier to put a hole in a fiberglass kayak than these polyethylene ones. So for durability, the slight hand goes to the polyethylene kayaks, all things given equal in the beginning. After a couple of, a decade or so, depending on how you store it, it depends on, if the thing's going to crack on you or break on you a lot easier. The biggest problem is people think polyethylene kayaks are completely indestructible. And they do have this kind of legendary kind of indestructibility. So you'll hear the guy say this: "Oh yeah, I drag mine across. I don't even pick it up. I don't portage it. I just drag it across the rocks, and it's fine." But then a couple of months later, you'll hear him say, "Oh, somehow there was it wore a hole in my kayak." It's like the bottom was just completely thinned out, and I don't understand why. It's because you've been dragging it across the rocks, you idiot. So really, when it comes down to it, if you want a kayak to last, whether you're talking a fiberglass one or a plastic one, you're gonna have to keep them off the rocks and stuff like that. And a lot of times, what people will do is paddle onto the shore, and this will basically every time you do that, every time you hit that beach sand, it's the same as sanding it, right? So at some point, it's going to thin out the bow uh, on in certain spots, whether it's polyethylene or fiberglass. It's just you might find it does it at different rates. So yeah, if you're going to have to portage the thing the normal way if you want it to last, um, because again, if you scratch up the bottom of the polyethylene kayak, you lose speed on that too. You know what I mean? So if you end up at the end of the day, if you want your kayak to perform well, you're going to have to lift it up and portage it and stuff like that. This is where fiberglass typically takes the advantage in that it's usually typically about 15% lighter. So a 50-pound or 60-pound kayak like this, or I think this was was 63 pounds, might be 45 in the fiberglass equivalent, or 50. So it depends, if you have extra add-ons on there or whatever. But typically it's lighter, and Kevlar is typically lighter than that. Problem is with fiberglass is it typically is about a third more expensive per size, sometimes double the price. That's what gets people is the price usually, because once you've basically paddled a fiberglass kayak, that sells you on it right away. It's like it's a stiffer ride, but yet it's smoother because it tracks better, it responds better, it's lighter. Lighter's easier to paddle. To accelerate. Not necessarily that the hull speed will be any faster. It's just it's quicker to get up to speed on something that's 15 pounds lighter. You tend to accelerate a little bit easier. Portaging becomes easier, etc., etc. So performance-wise, yeah, the performance. When I talk performance, I'm not talking the extreme stuff. I'm talking just the ease of which you'll make a turn, the ease of which you'll handle, go over waves, just the way it rides. Fiberglass is a lot nicer. However, durability is slightly too. If you do hit something, plastic floats. You know what I mean? You will take on water, but at least you got something that will still stay on the surface. It might, even though it's just below the surface, you can float yourself to shore on it. Can you sink a fiberglass? Well, it has a bit of a, it could have buoyancy built in too. But if you really wreck the thing and put a hole in the fiberglass, yeah, it'll go to the bottom. You know what I mean. Like it won't float. But that the odds of that happening, I mean, if it's really really rare that happens. Like I've not too many people I've talked to that have had a kayak fold. If they're in a position where the fiberglass kayak's going to fold on them, chances are they're in a position where the polyethylene kayak is going to fold on them. So I'm not really worried about that kind of stuff. And typically a sea kayak, you're not going into white water with it. That is really a specific type of kayak. There are people that do it, but it's usually on pieces of river where they know that they're not going to be hitting the rocks and stuff like that, and they go around the rocks and they stay with the surf or whatever, and they're usually okay with that. But sea kayaks are usually going to be you better, if you can't afford the fiberglass or Kevlar, you're definitely Kevlar. Will leave that as a separate topic, but definitely you won't regret the fiberglass. So how do you get into a fiberglass kayak? Well, if you gotta buy new, this is the problem. Like when you have the money, you don't buy new. But I say don't buy new if it's your first kayak. Buy used. Because if you buy new, like for example, for the money I spent on my new, that was about $400 brand new, and it was nice to have a new kayak. You know what I mean? And it was like at $400, if I used it twice in the season, I could flog it for probably half the price, and it's not a big loss. And it's not a massive loss of money. But if I bought, say, a $3,500 or $2,500, more like $3,000 to $3,500 is going to be a typical fiberglass kayak for you, right? New, maybe even more. If you use that twice a year, that's a huge investment in something you're not using. I wouldn't recommend that. But you can sometimes find a kayak that's almost in brand new condition, that's barely been used, in which most people, it seems like the more they spend on something, the less they use it. But it's not uncommon to get for example, I saw an Alvik Boreal kayak fiberglass. Sucker's like $3,500 new or 3,400 or whatever, Canadian. And I saw it used for $1,000. That's a steal, especially if you know it's something you're going to use for a long time, if you like that type of kayak. I keep referring to, before you buy a kayak, go out to the demo nights, see what you like. Because just because the specs might meet your criteria, you really got to get in them and see how they ride. Because sometimes, there's you get in there and it's not as comfortable as you thought, or you looked at it and it's like, well, that one's not going to be what I want. You get in there and it's like the thing completely surprises you, and it handles the way you want. It does all the things you want. The other thing too is you pick it up. Make a test lift a part of your kayak demo night. So if you go out, and almost all the major box stores do this if they're near water. They'll say, okay, yeah, like we have a kayak demo night at this beach on Wednesday night or a Thursday night. They just bring a whole bunch of kayaks to the beach. You just jump in them. You sign a little sheet and you jump in them. You go out for 5 minutes, you come back, you let somebody else take a turn. And if you know how to test a kayak, you can find out almost everything you need to know in 5 minutes. The only things you're not going to know is like wind, wave, and current condition, how it handles that until you test them in that, right? But sometimes you get a little bit of wind. It's like, okay, well, I can see how this thing would be good in the wind, and you can do a apples to apples comparison from kayak to kayak. But it also gives you the huge advantage of being able not only to test the kayaks, but to test, can you carry it, etc., etc. The build quality, all that stuff. You get to really see that up hand first close. And what you'll find is typically the fiberglass kayaks are actually built quite well. Don't worry about durability and hitting rocks. And again, even if you're in the shallow stuff, I mean, most kayaks don't even draw like 4 inches of water. So grounding out is not a big deal. And it's not like you're going to hold the thing. I mean, fiberglass is a lot tougher than people give them credit. I mean, it's when you're dragging them on the rocks and stuff. The canoes are notorious for having the rear part of the canoe worn down because of people dragging it across rocks and stuff like that. But I mean, canoes. I mean, I've banged around canoes quite a bit, and I've yet to hold one. And again, I've hit some pretty hard, hard rocks and stuff like that, and not even leave a mark. So they are pretty tough. Kayaks typically are built, the way the glass is laid up. It's usually a little bit thinner than that you would see on some canoes. Where canoes might have like 1/2 inch or 5/8 thick fiberglass. You might not quite get that thick on a kayak, so it might be a little bit lighter, but it's also or a little bit lighter built. But it's also, again, it's going to take a few bumps and bruises. But like anything, every scratch you put on the bottom of the boat is lost speed. Just always think about it like that. So is fiberglass better? Well, the pros are the performance, the handling. Usually it's usually lighter. The cons are it's more expensive. It's not usually as durable as the polyethylene. On a really hard hit. So that's your pros and your cons there. The polyethylene tends to be cheaper. That's a pro. They're not as stiff, so that's a con. They can tend to take a good bashing, but another con for the plastic is sometimes it's harder to repair than the fiberglass. That's a positive for the fiberglass. So these are just little things you can look at and make your own judgment whether you think it's better to go. On the used market, if you try a kayak, try to find it used. Again, if it's got a ding or two in it, it's not a big deal. If it's been well looked after, chances are, I mean, these things will last years and years and years and years and years. I mean, there's some people that bought their kayaks like 30 years ago, and you'd look at it, oh, did you just buy that? Because they took such good care of it, you know. So whichever way you go, again, if you can get a hold of a cheap under $1,000 a kayak, if you know you're going to stick with it, it's one of those things I wouldn't recommend a heavy investment like that for your first kayak, new. But again, for the money I spent on my first kayak, the recreational kayak, that's $400 brand new that I could have put, another maybe $200 and bought a fiberglass kayak. But again, I recommend probably buy your first kayak used in any category. And then see if you're going to stick with it. If you know you're going to stick with it, and then okay, well then go for very something specific. If you can't find it used, then buy it new. If you could swing the money, but that's only if you're going to use it. For me, I knew if I have if I get a fiberglass kayak, even though after I bought my Inukshuk, I was like, yeah, my next kayak's going to be a fiberglass one, just because of the way I used the Inukshuk. It wouldn't be a pain to. Again, I treated the Inukshuk as if it was a fiberglass kayak anyway. So it would be nice to have something a little bit lighter, a little bit stiffer, and better performance. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. So you guys make your own decisions, but there's just some things to ponder. So anyway, rate, subscribe, share, comment, like. Be true to yourselves. Be true to us. Always, always do the right thing. Have yourselves a great day, eh?